Hi, this is Anil Bhatia, and welcome to another episode of TFR Insights. So today we have with us Pete Jarvis. You are VP of Business Development at Polyverse, and we discussed about this earlier. So what I want to talk to you about today is a bit of how privacy is changing in this changing landscape that the world that we'll be living in the post COVID-19 era. At the same time, instead of helping people, both private companies as well as public servants or governments, they're trying to use this opportunity to actually gain more access to our digital life to kind of erode any privacy that we have. So let's start with privacy in this post-COVID world. What does it look like?
It's really interesting. So you and I were joking about this earlier, where I said, if I'd come to you 6 months ago and said, "Hey, I want to install an application onto your phone, and it will track all of your movements and all of your whereabouts and everyone that you interact with," I think you would have turned around to me and had a very different answer. So, what would you have answered 6 months ago if I'd offered that to you?
I would say, no way, are you joking?
Yeah. So I think that this is the interesting bit right now. If I come to you and I say the same thing, it's a very different world, and people go, "Oh, well, maybe I could use that because then I could track who I'd interacted with." And I was talking to some friends about this because they were saying, "Well, only the good people will be worried." And I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Well, if I'm a good person, I don't have to worry." And I said, that's a really interesting position to hold. So Swapnil, now you're in a situation where someone can go back and look at your entire web history. Imagine if they look at your children and they look at all of the web history coming out of your house. I find that really fascinating because the argument that was used is, well, if I'm a good person, it's not a problem. And I always say there are no good or bad people. There is a spectrum, So it's sort of, I don't know. I'm interested to see how you would feel about it from that point of view, because it has far-reaching implications for privacy.
When you say, if good people should worry about it, bad people should not. Here's the thing, as you rightly said, why do we take shower in private? Why do we have bedrooms, or other, why do we lock our bedrooms at night? Why do we have doors? There are a lot of things which are by the very nature, they are private. Like the kind of conversation I have with my wife is totally different in house when I talk to her in personal. At the same time, you and I professionally, we may have a very professional conversation right now because we are talking for camera, but we can have a very private conversation about a lot of different things that could be sensitive in nature for businesses. It could be trade secret. It could be very, very personal in nature. And it is not about good versus bad. It's about the nature of the conversation. I may have my two sons can have a kind of weird conversation with each other. They are like 4 and 7 year old. That should not go public. So privacy is not about you did something wrong versus you did. It's not about if you don't have anything to hide, you should not worry about it. It's not about hiding. Like, let's say about if you have a daughter and she goes to a gyno or for any of the health, why should that information be public, or why should any government agency have access to that information? Because information can be weaponized in any form or way. So it has nothing to do with whether you're a good guy or bad guy. You do take shower and do other things in the privacy, and there is a very good reason for that.
Yeah, I think that's a great. I've always described it like this, right? The way I countered that argument when I was talking to some friends, right? I turned around and said, "Hey, can I describe it differently to you?" And they said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "The key thing is." You have to look at it not at the fact that information is retrieved. It is the intent behind the retrieval of the information. Because if the intent is valuable, then I have no problem. The question is what is the use of the information? And so a classic example of this, is that the Amazon camera and Alexa. So essentially, there was a lot of debate saying, hey, they're taking all of these recordings and they're analyzing them to improve the service. And so, that was brought up. And I said, well, actually, I see no problem with that. I said, here's the problem that you get into is that this is a very gray area of privacy. What's happening now is and this has happened throughout history, is that whenever there's a situation where people can gain more information, they generally take it. Yeah. The question then will be is that when 9/11 occurred, there was this huge situation where they wanted to suddenly be able to get all of this information about all of these different people. And the reason and the intent behind it, I think, was a good one. And then the question is where do you take that? And I think this is one of the key things to me is when we look at privacy now in the post-COVID world is when do you actually go back and say, hey, we don't need that information anymore? When do we turn it off? And in general, whenever you turn something on, you never turn it off. So you're now in a situation whereby you and I are going to be, all of the information about our movement, in theory, could be kept for an indefinite period. There's a fun story behind this, actually. I don't know, have you ever heard the story of the click-through agreement, where it came from?
Fear.
So it was Microsoft. When they first developed the software, they had to have a license agreement signed and sent back after you bought Windows 386. And what happened was they came up with the idea of saying, well, we put this little sticker on the box, and by opening the box and tearing the piece of paper, you agree to the license. The interesting thing is no one ever reads the license. And then that's now moved to the web. So when you go to any of these websites, have you ever read the license?
I used to read it when I was pure GNU GPL guy, but not anymore.
Well, it's fascinating to me, right? Because what's happened is that now you have all of these defensive postures which says, hey, you click through the license to use the product, so therefore you agree to the license. And the problem is no one reads them. So there's a question of enforcement. But the aspect of that that's really interesting to me is in the context of privacy, is that a lot of these mobile applications and web applications ask for and require that you allow them to sell and share all of your information. And it's a treasure trove of data. And so I think one of the things that we're starting to see is people are becoming more aware of that. And there is a law that says below a certain age, you can't target children with advertising. Yeah. But the question is how do you know? So where I come from is this, right, is if you look at it, I see two problems at the moment. Mm-hmm. One is you have this fundamental problem of access to data, where there's just a huge amount of data being generated off individuals. And that in itself, in some ways, is not bad. It really comes down to the question of how that information is harnessed and used. The classic example is that there's now a bunch of companies that were going out and going to the You Have Been Pawned website and showing that they got taken the passwords that they knew had been stolen, correlating them with different websites, then going and sending emails to people saying, we have all of this information on you, send us Bitcoin information and we'll never talk about it. Which I went, that's a fascinating application of blackmail. Mm-hmm. So that component of it is interesting. Then the second component is really around the ability to remove information, which it sounds simple, right? But the problem is that if someone posts something on Facebook or they post something on the web, if it goes viral, you have no ability to turn it off. And, the famous guy that you should look to is a guy called Benjamin Rush. He's one of the founding fathers, and he's actually the person who lobbied really heavily to get rid of the concept of pillory. And what's happened now is pillory has come back, but it's through Twitter. So someone says something or does something, and then suddenly all of that information and the reaction of the human herd means that the person's life is destroyed. And it can take them years to recover from that. So this to me is really the two pillars of when we start talking about identity, security, and information. Is I have no control of where that information goes. I can't delete it, and nor can I remove bad information. So imagine if something happened and you want to delete something that's incorrect. It's incredibly difficult for you to delete it, if not impossible.
Right. I have a couple of thoughts there, which I wanted to your opinion on. Number one is that you mentioned, that, companies, organizations are, collecting as much data as they can. Amazon could be, everyone is doing it. Here's the problem. You might trust X company today that, hey, you know what, their owners, the founder are good guys. You trusted them because they have been operating in this space for a long time. What if the company gets acquired? And it gets acquired by, I'm not trying to single out any company or country, so I don't want to name them, but let's say a North Korean company, they acquire their company. Now, all of your information is in their hands. What would you do? That's number one. Number two is that when you say that, there are a lot of laws in Europe, and that's a good thing, though. When you work with government, it's become kind of, it's not very efficient, but still there are a lot of things. But the problem is that how do you ensure that the company has actually deleted the information? They may delete the information from the front end where you can search for the information. Let's say if you send me some information, hey, Swapnil, after the interview, you delete the information, you go to the site, you don't find it. It can still be on my data server. I can still harness this information for a lot of different things. You will not be able to know whether I have that information or not. It's not just a legal thing. Okay, legally you have deleted it, it's gone. But what about the ethical part of it? What about the moral part of it? Just because you can, should you?
This is something that's really gets interesting. So give you an example. Health insurance in America is a really interesting area. And, there's amazing people doing amazing things at the moment, right? And that is truly, it's impressive. One of the things that's really interesting, though, is the records, the health records. So if you work with one health insurer for a period of time and then you swap to another health insurance company, one of the things that's really interesting is do they keep the records? Well, this actually happened to me. Someone broke into one of the healthcare companies and they stole all the records. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then we get a note, I think it was like 7 years later, and they go, hey, our records were broken into and you're one of the X million people where they stole all your records. And we're like going, we hadn't had a relationship with this company for like 7 years, I think. And we're going, you still had our records? And so the interesting bit there is there's no definition of time over where the records are stored. The other thing is that companies and entities rarely delete anything. And the hard disk companies are very happy about that, right? Because, if you think about it, the amount of data that we store, if there's one company that's going to do well out of that, it's flash storage and hard disk storage and the tape providers. So where I come from on this is I sort of look at it as there's a really interesting two concepts that are starting to come to the forefront is one is this nature of who owns the data. And there are actually now a set of startups who are starting to come into this and say, hey, we want the owner of the data to be the human being. And then they give access to the companies the information. And then the information is deleted. And there's something called polymorphic encryption. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. And that's the usual effect that it has on people when you mention that term. But one of the things that's happening is now people are encrypting all the data themselves, share it with a company. But the reality is that there's so much information out there now. The government want to gain access to that information because it gives them such a powerful indicator about what is happening with a human being. The original work that was done with Facebook was really about defining the 5 emotional states of people. And that then becomes incredibly powerful for identifying the individual and what they're doing. And so you get to this situation that I think is a bit scary, which is one, you have no idea where your information is being used. 2, right, there's no way for you to track or manipulate it. And the really interesting one is if that information is wrong. Yeah. Have you heard about the guy who had the null number plate in California? so he put null on the number plate, and then because of that, he ended up with all of the accidental speeding tickets in California, and a massive amount of money that was owed. And the characteristic there is this then comes back to this concept of privacy: is who actually should own the data? And then the other question for the government, which I think is becoming really complex, is, what rights does the government have to that information? And then also, what are the rights of the individual? Because this is polarizing between Apple and Google. So if you look at their two business models, Apple is very much saying, well, actually, we don't like this concept of complete exposure, and we're locking down the phones and the devices to try and hold on to the information for the individual. Where if you use Android, the amount of information that they can extract is tremendous. And it's not about right and wrong, it's just about two approaches. My worry, though, is if I think about, your children and families and what they're doing, I think the biggest concern I have is that there's two things. One is this concept of forgiveness. And the other one then is the right to be forgotten. Yeah. Because it's sort of built into our legal system that, if you do something wrong, you're punished. And then after the punishment, you are free. You are expunged from your crime. The difference now is because of the changes in the internet, the changes in the record retrieval, etc. It's created a huge bunch of problems. For example, if someone's had a crime and they fill out a employment record, they were required to declare if they were a criminal. Yeah. And it meant that then they can't get jobs. And at that point, they can't actually function in society. So they go back to being a criminal.
You mentioned, that the governments and all those, they do want it. Another thing is happening, and that is as we are kind of realizing the importance of data, and then we are driving driverless cars, Tesla cars, they are collecting massive amount of data, where you're driving, everything they know. Plus, with these embedded devices, Edge, IoT, Nest, and all those things, I also feel that instead of collecting data that the companies need, now they're just collecting everything that they can grab their hands onto, because they don't know the value of that data today. But with the emergence of all these machine learning technologies, they can extract some value tomorrow.
So there's a beautiful thing there. I'll give you a real example, yeah? Because a lot of people talk about machine learning and AI. But there's two aspects to this that are really important to understand. So I'll give an example. If I take a set of X-rays, and I take those X-rays, and let's say it's examples of ankle breaks. So all it is just a bunch of X-rays that show broken ankles. Now, in itself, that's worthless, right? Now, if I take all of the human doctor annotations, which identify what happened with those breaks, how they occurred, etc., I have all of that information. And now I combine those two, and I run that through a machine learning algorithm, so that I can now take that data and create a model that allows me to take another X-ray of a broken ankle, and based on the learning from the first data set, be able to say, oh, this is the type of break, this is the type of recommendation for recovery we want to do. Now, the interesting thing there is that there's a couple of areas that become really interesting. So first of all, the knowledge that was built into the model is actually derived from human beings, but they gain nothing from it, right? Their knowledge is essentially, from their perspective, they've given the knowledge, but there is no value that's been given to them. The person who makes the money is the person who takes those two sets of data, combines them, and sells them to an AI company and says, this is a great training model for your medical research platform. Yeah. And so what you end up doing is in a really interesting way is, on the one side, you've arguably stolen a bunch of valuable information from one perspective. On the other side, you've created an amazing tool to help those doctors. and also to help the patients. But it's a very complex problem, because a lot of them at the moment, a lot of the issues that are really coming to a head is fundamentally about the change about ownership of information, right? So all of that knowledge that's condensed into the doctor's notes, right, is worth a lot of money if you build it into a machine learning model. But in itself, it's not worth anything. And that, to me, I think, is where we're going to get into a really interesting debate over the next 10 years, because I think we're getting to a point where people have realized they're going, hold on, a lot of my information is being used by other people, and I participate in none of the value. And so the question to me is that, will it cut to a point where a company comes up and says, this is how we can monetize your information, and would you pay for that? Or would they pay you for it? That, I think, is fascinating.
At the same time, we have already seen examples like Facebook. You are giving everything away, and what you get in return is you get to use the service for free so that we can collect more information. Or there are some cases where you do get a lot of value in return, and that's where I'm willing to make a trade-off. A very good example is Google Maps. Okay, I do let them know where I am right now. They do know my location all the time. They know where I go to on a regular basis. But what also helps me in knowing is the fastest route to X from Z. So if I have to go and pick up my son, that information will help me in picking the fastest route or knowing there's a traffic jam. If I look at the old days navigation system, it only shows you from A to Z. That's what it was. There was nothing else. No information was there that was able. Oh, look at Waze. So there are a lot of models where the user is getting something in return. Now, what value is there in your data is totally different thing, but they do get something in return. But yes, you are right that at the same time, companies will come up with models that will kind of either tell them to get incentivized, or they might come up with something like Creative Commons that, hey, you know what, you just give it all under some kind of Creative Commons license where we are free to use it. So yeah, it is a tricky thing. We don't know how things will shape up. But what I'm more worried about is that right now there is a kind of hand-in-hand collaboration between private companies, which are kind of abusive, and government agencies. They're working together to collect more information on us and make us even more vulnerable instead of protecting our privacies. Especially in the US. I don't know, in the Europe, they do a lot of things. But what are your thoughts about this? This trend that we are seeing is that instead of protecting us, they're actually making us more vulnerable.
Well, I think so what's really interesting, right? It's a spectrum. Yeah, because I mean, this is why I went back to that original point. It's why are you getting the information, and what are you going to do with it? Because those 2 points are really important. So, give an example. If I'm retrieving the information to identify terrorists or criminals, then I see value. If I'm retrieving that information to manipulate someone for the purpose of government, then it's really dangerous. And the other aspect is if you look at different countries, right? So if you look at China and you look at America, they're very different, yeah? And the problem is we think of them as two big units. But then when you actually look at America, it's a whole bunch of states. And the states are very different in their interpretation of the law. And the same occurs in China. But one of the things that's a classic example here is everyone wants to gain more data, yeah? The problem with the aggregation of that level of information is, it's a bit like the do no evil in Google, where they did a mathematical model and they said, no, it's impossible. We will have someone in the company who's going to do evil. So they removed the statement from the Google goal, which I thought was interesting because personally I would have said, no, we should aspire to do no evil. So when you look at it from that point of view, here's the really scary bit to me is we have to define the controls on the application and usage of the data. And at the moment, you cannot do that, I think, through legal processes because you can't have a binary. It's like yes or no. This is the beauty of a judge, right? What is the purpose of a judge? A judge, the intent of creating a judge was to take into account the nuance of the arguments and to provide the appropriate decision to the situation. And when you get into these situations where you say, oh no, the judge can only give this answer or this answer, the problem is then what you do is you create real problems because you can't take into account the nuance of the arguments. And the same is true of government, right? I think one of the things you have to be able to do is say, hey, this is a very complex situation. We need some level of oversight that allows us to choose how we apply what we do with this data. Some of that will never be in the public. My worry is that we're in this situation where people are saying, oh no, it's a binary. It's either yes or no, right? We must be able to collect this information. And I go, well, hold on, be careful, because this is actually a nuanced and complex problem. And people want a simple answer to a nuanced and complex problem. And so what I always say is to say, look, I can understand why the data is collected. I completely understand it. If you go to the UK, there's a fantastic example of the videos where they backtrack the bombers all the way to Leeds, right? And so when you look at that, that's valuable. But the question is if I could find out that a politician was having an affair, or if I could find out a politician had done something, and I'm in government, and then I go to that politician and say, you must vote in this direction because I know this information, that is where there's very clear lines. Yeah. But the one that really scares me is that it's children. Because if I'd been recorded when I was 16 or 14, yeah, I think of all the mad things we did. And I'm going, now I'm talking to all of my friends' children, and I'm going, well, you shouldn't do that because there could be a camera. And they're going, what's your point? I was going like, think about that. And they're going, oh yeah, but no one would ever photograph me. And I said, I guarantee that someone will. Who is the famous, there was a famous swimmer, and he was photographed smoking a joint, and he lost his Coca-Cola advertising campaign, I believe. And it was a moment where someone photographed him that he wasn't aware. And you're saying that is the difference now. The impact of this access to cameras, information, etc., is so tremendous, and the amount of information they can retrieve on you. The famous, actually, this is a real example. There was a friend of mine who wanted to find someone that he'd worked with, and he went onto one of these sites, and he paid to find the person. And I this is 7 years ago, and I said, you literally paid? He said, yeah, I paid, and I got in touch with them. And I said, why? And he goes, well, I wanted to talk to them about something that happened 25 years ago. And I was going, okay, that's scary that you can do that. So my singular advice would be is train your children well.
Well, you can train your children when you yourself are not on Facebook. I was actually shocked to see how many people, especially here in the US, are on Facebook despite all these warnings. Forget about the public post. The worst thing is those private groups, because on private groups you have this sense of privacy that, hey, nobody can look into it and we can discuss whatever we want. That is more dangerous. That's more like installing a web camera in your bedroom. If the web company tells you that, hey, you know what, whatever you do in your in your bedroom, that's totally private, nobody will ever get access to it, and you can freely do whatever you want to do, and that is what happens in the private groups. Plus, I have seen people who go to stores and they are willing to fill a form that takes their house address, their telephone number, their contact information, so that they can get a 1% discount on all their shipping. So they literally tell the company, hey, you can track me as much as you want as long as you're giving me 1%. So when you live in a world like this, how can you expect us to tell our kids that, hey, don't do that, because we're not doing it? Which brings to the point of education. We are not aware of it. We are not well educated about it. And on the contrary to that, we are getting incentivized to actually share that information. There a sense of, so that is also there.
Well, I'll give you one of the things that I think is fascinating at the moment. That I'm really interested in this area of it. Is that if you look at the way identity works today, two of the principal attack vectors, right, on people this is particularly American, is stealing your health identity so that you can get health coverage, and that in itself is really interesting. And then the other one is stealing an identity to get a credit card. And everyone pictures this as like an individual going out, creating this account and then doing this. But it actually turns around, that is the economics of the cyber attack. Because what I'm doing is I'm trawling all this information to get information about users or people so that I can create credit card applications. Then when I get all the credit cards, I give the credit cards to the mules. The mules go out and buy things, and then they send them back to me. And then I sell them on a different service like eBay or Amazon, yeah. Alternatively, you do debit cards, and they literally walk down the street going to each bank, taking out the money, and they get 20% of the credit card. But what you get is identity theft. And so a lot of it comes down to this. It's a really interesting problem that identity and privacy now are coming to a head, because on the one side, your identity, your credit card score, etc., is yours. But the other thing is it really wasn't developed for you. It was developed for the companies to be able to make an assessment of whether you're a good customer. Because fundamentally, we've moved to an advertising paradigm. There's a interesting guy, Jaron Lanier. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, and he wrote a book, "You Are Not a Gadget." And honestly, it's worth reading. He also wrote "Who Owns the Future?" But the reason I bring him up is he was one of the first people to identify, saying, hey, there's a problem with this concept of identity and security. And it goes back to the founding fathers, because Benjamin Stotts, I believe that was his name, was the guy who highlighted, he said, look, if you can't have this concept of forgetting, if you can't forget something, then that will live with you forever and it will destroy your life. And so this is one of the things I think that we're going to have to get to, is that when you start looking at, the Patriot Act, some of the work that's going on at the moment, this concept of forgetting something is becoming a problem, because what I do at 12 or what I do at 16 or 18 or 24 or 30 could be completely different to what I do when I'm 38, right? And also I can lie about my age. So that to me is where you look at these issues and you're going, hey, where is it that you draw the line on forgetting? Where is it that you have this concept of forgiving? Because if you don't have that, if you can never forget and you can never step aside from something you did in the past, you can never be reformed. And it's interesting because everyone goes to prison, but they never come out. In America, we have the largest prison population in the world. And I think part of that is because we have a problem where people can't forget.
I want to wrap this up, but before we wrap this up, what I want you to summarize quickly is that in this post-COVID-19 world, we have discussed how the whole privacy will change. We will have even less privacy than we have today or yesterday. You cannot do anything for people who do not want to change or who are comfortable with that. But there are a lot of people who do want to protect their privacy. There are a lot of people who do want to protect their... Do you have some quick 4 or 5 tips that these are the 5 things you should do, irrespective of unless it's mandated by law that you have to, and that might also happen at some point, but some precautions that we can take to ensure whatever privacy we are left with at the moment, even if you're...
Yeah, so I will say some things on this. Is I look at it from 2 fronts. One is there's identity privacy. So give you an example. I always joke with people, say, choose wisely the name of your first pet, because it's going to be with you for the rest of your life. And then I say, on all the questions that you fill in on various sites, make up the answers, don't use the truth, because the truth actually is easily accessible, whereas the made up information is not, right? And then the other thing that I always say to people is saying, look, there are a couple of things that you should always remember. One is, when you write something in public or when you say something in public, it can and will be used against you. So never send an email in anger and never tweet in anger, because one of the things that you will learn from that is that I'm a real fan. I'm a genuine fan of how to win friends and influence people. And one of the points that is made in that book is to never criticize, right? And so my point is on Twitter and some of these services, it's much better not to criticize, but rather to ask questions and understand. And there was a great point that you made earlier. So the one is never criticize. 2 is be careful on what you say and where you say it. 3 is remember, if you're going to say something or if you're going to do something, it's way better to ring them up and talk to them than it is to write it down and send it, because once you've sent it, you do not know where it goes. You have no control. The 4th one to me, which is really important, is to understand that, people talk about the fact that they're on the web and they've turned on all the privacy and things like this, etc. And I go, look, the whole point of that web browser in most cases is to extract information about you. And if you think of it that way, you can be very well informed about how you use the internet. And one of the things there that I always say to people is, I say, don't go or be careful on the sites that you go to, because those are the sites that will extract the information or will control you. And the final one, which is this has come up of late, is a lot of people are installing all of these little tools into their Google application. Yeah. And this is a real example where someone sold one of their tools. It's just a ruler to a third party, and that third party then installed spyware into the tool. It was a legitimate tool that was being used. So I say be very careful about what you install on your computer. If you're not using it, delete it. And that's actually probably the best advice I can give to people is if you're installing something on your computer and it's free, it isn't.
That's very true. Yeah, either and there can be some exception, but I just say, if you're not paying for it, you are the product. I want to end it. I also want to end it at a light note. And then when you say, don't give out right information, always make things up. But number 1 is remember it. The second is that make sure that your spouse doesn't see it, because if you put the name of your first child and she doesn't know that, so she will think that.
Yeah, that could be awkward. Hey, I like that. I will use that.